Hello! We're trying something different today, mostly because I was bored of the Iliad and couldn't bother to make the book 12 video. He dies, that's it. The Roman race is founded. So we're going back in a bid to sort of help you revise year 12 content in the run up to your exam. I have narrowed these down in terms of themes based on what hasn't come up before, in the hope that it might come up in the future. So obviously your module is called World of the Hero, and so the heroism is a big topic, and you would never get an essay that says like, what is a hero? But what we have had come up is before these Greek terms where they test your knowledge on the Greek terms. So Xeni has come up before, and there's been an essay, a 20 marker in 2019 on what was most important to Achilles, where you're sort of expected to bring in and evaluate these ideas and these concepts of heroism. Obviously last year there was an essay on Hector as a human or hero. So understanding these will come up not so much. The question won't be written like this in a very simple term, but you would be expected to have an understanding of both Time and Kleos, and be able to evaluate the behaviour of heroes, in particular Achilles and Hector. Obviously, the first thing that you would need to do if you were talking about these two concepts, Time and Kleos, is be able to define them. Define them nice and early. You need to define them in your introduction if you're going to use them. All of the examiner reports where these sorts of questions have come up have said that people are confused about these terms and get them muddled. And that's going to cost you very dearly in terms of your marks on your essays. So I'm going to approach these two things separately and give you some examples of where they come up. As with everything, this is not an exhaustive list. These examples that I'm bringing up to you are what I would say might be things that you forget or that are sort of more nuanced, and you can make a more nuanced point about them. So first things first, Time, honour. And so OCR tells you that this means this is honour, and I would actually boil it down to this idea of how much do people worship you while you're alive. Time in ancient Greek society is very linked with cult worship and this idea of revering someone, honouring them as something extraordinary in terms of their greatness. And so that's what the Time is. And this is very, very important. And there's lots of ways in which it comes up in the Iliad. The first one is really, really obvious in terms of Achilles and Agamemnon in book 1. We see, obviously, both of them get frustrated with the other, to put it mildly. They've disrespected each other in front of people, and they've undermined their authority in front of people. And so this is a damaged Time. It's a Time. So it's a damage to their Time. One might boil it down to this idea that it's about Briseis. It's not about Briseis. We see in book 9 that it's no longer about Geras. Achilles focuses on this idea that it is about the humiliation. He mentions it in book 9. He mentions it in book 16 before he sends Patroclus off to war, that he's still angry about it. Even when he forgives him in books 19 and 21, he still mentions how horrible it was. And so he still bears that very, very seriously. The insult is only ever really replaced in terms of his menace by his grief and his anger towards Hector. In book 1, we also see Thetis begging Zeus on behalf of Achilles to restore Achilles' honour, to restore Time to Achilles. And when Achilles goes to kill Agamemnon, it's only Athena's promise of 3 times the Geras that stops Achilles from killing Agamemnon. Geras is basically a physical representation of how much one is honoured. It's a symbol of the gifts and the women as well. There are some key examples. So we obviously see that it's really, really important for Agamemnon in book 1 to not be seen to have fewer items or items of less value than the other men. He's very much comparing himself to others, that it wouldn't be right if he loses Chryseis and somebody else has a woman. That's not right to him. The Geras is part of this really fragile equation of the heroic code where Time and your Geras equals Kleos, which we'll come to later. So having this honour and this respect minus your life, because you are risking losing your life, is worth it because it equals Kleos. And that equation for a hero balances out. Time plus Geras minus life equals Kleos. Agamemnon destabilizes this in his actions by taking Achilles' Geras. because he's getting rid of one side of the equation. The seesaw doesn't balance anymore. We also see how important it is to Hector, for example, in book 17, when he goes back and puts on Achilles' armor as a way of rallying his men and sort of creating this idea of fame around himself. So it's not just important to Achilles. We see that Geras is important to Hector as well. So the respect and the opinion of others is really crucial to your teammate. Agamemnon falls foul of this in book 4 when he insults Diomedes. When he's going around rallying all the men, he insults Diomedes, says, "You're not as good as your father." Diomedes takes this in his stride, takes it on the chin. When he criticizes Odysseus, however, Odysseus refuses to be insulted and to have his teammate undermined, and he bites back at Agamemnon. It's not just on the Greek side. We see this concern about other people's opinion on the Trojan side as well in Hector, who wants to avoid eidos, that shame. Remember, eidos, A-I-D-O-S, shame. He wants to avoid that, and we see that in book 6, as he says that he would feel nothing but shame before the Trojans and the Trojan women in their trailing gowns if he did not fight. He says that in book 6 to Andromache. He says that exact same line in book 22 when he considers going back into the town. He says that I would feel nothing but shame before the Trojans and the Trojan women in their trailing gowns. So we see on both sides, for both the Trojans and the Greeks, worrying about the opinion of others and how you are honoured and what they think of you is all part of that teaming. Now, if you've got this idea of teaming in an essay, I would of course mention that fighting prowess is a really key way in which you demonstrate demonstrate your greatness. You can win glory, you can win teaming when you're alive. But I would say that it's also, don't just focus on that at the expense of quieter moments, because we see that respect is not just about fighting and how you're seen on the battlefield, and being a hero is not just about fighting and being seen, see how you are seen on the battlefield. If you wrote that in an essay, quite frankly, you deserve a C grade. If that's all you focus on is fighting, boo-boo, you suck, you're dumb. I'm joking, you're not. But it's a bad essay. You want to be focusing on the quieter moments, such as the funeral games in book 23. We see Menelaus become irate with Antilochus because he cheats him out of a prize. He cheats at the race, and he's hugely humiliated at this, and he needs, and it's important, a very public apology. And it is only when he gets a public apology from Antilochus, as well as the Geras, as well as the prize, that he starts to bear that insult less heavily. I think also it's important to focus on the quieter and the smaller characters, such as the old men and their view of honour. It's always worth paying attention to what old men think about various themes, as they've seen lots of generations of men. So we see Nestor in book 1, he tries to act like a peacekeeper. He tries to restore hierarchy and respect between Achilles and Agamemnon. It doesn't work, but he says, Achilles, you've got to respect him because he is more powerful than you. Agamemnon, you have to respect Achilles because Achilles is a better fighter than you. Obviously, that doesn't work. Phoenix in book 9, when he goes to Achilles, he uses the story of Meleager to warn Achilles not to lose the respect of his men before it's too late. Again, doesn't really work. And then in book 24, we get Priam and Achilles' reconciliation, that honour, that respect that we see Achilles and Priam have for their enemy, which is truly, I think, the highest form of respect that you can have if you are respected even by the person that is your enemy. Taplin calls this a quiet, rare moment of glory. So we get lots of examples here in terms of time, how people are seen, how important it is to all of our heroes. So if time is how much people worship you when you are alive, kleos is obviously how much will people worship you when you're dead. How do you get kleos? Well, kleos is passed down through art. This can be both poems and through other types of art. And so it's important to think about how the actual vehicle through which glory is passed down and what they are aspiring to and how they expect to achieve that glory. So we see this first with Helen in book 3, and her very first appearance in the Iliad. She's weaving the stories of the Trojan War. And later in book 6, she reflects to Hector that she thinks that they are the subjects of poems of generations not yet born. So people in the future are going to sing about us, is what she says. She is aware that at the moment what they are going through is something that needs to be recorded. This is a really key role of women in kleos, because they're the only survivors of the losing side. They're the men's only hope of continuing their glory. We also see it in book 9 with Achilles when he's singing the poems of previous heroes. When he's by his heart with Patroclus, he's singing about exactly what he hopes to achieve, to be the song of people that will sing about him in his fighting role. This is something that he too aims towards. The men also talk about those that they admire more specifically. And we see that through these little side stories. So in book 4, like I said, Agamemnon rebukes Diomedes by mentioning how brilliant his father was. And he goes into details that he knows about his father. And so people know about Tydeus. We also see in book 6, obviously we get Glaucus. He mentions the story of Bellerophon, his great-grandfather, I can't remember which one it is. Glaucus ends that by saying that he hopes to live up to his ancestors. That is what motivates him. And so the men try to live up to these stories and try to be great so that their future generations will also sing about them. Indeed, by being included in the poem at all, there's this sort of meta poetry where they have achieved the kleos. So by the Iliad is a story of men hoping to achieve kleos, but by being part of the poem, they've achieved the kleos. And so we get this sort of circle paradox type thing. And the way that Homer gives some minor characters more airtime than others, for example, my favourite, Simoisius in book 4, he gets several lines of mourning and backstory. And so Homer takes time to elevate even the minor characters and give them kleos, which shows that it's important not just to our big heroes, but it's also important to everybody else as well. This is sort of the age of heroes where this is what they should be aspiring to. So obviously Achilles' gradual acceptance of himself, his mortality, the life he wishes to lead, that's basically the entire story of the Iliad. We have this idea of his choice. Remember his choice that he can either stay in the Trojan War, but he's going to die and die famous, or he can go back and live a long but forgettable life. So this is hinted at in book 1, but it's only properly articulated in book 9 when he speaks to the embassy. He's different from the others because he knows he will die if he fights here. Part of what motivates the heroes in the Trojan War is this hope, this tiny glimmer of hope, and we see it with Hector in book 22 when he goes and fights Achilles. He says, perhaps I might win. Even though he knows that it's probably not going to happen, every other hero has this idea of maybe there is a glimmer, teeny tiny glimmer of hope that I might survive. Achilles doesn't have that. He knows for certain that sort of heroic code, if we go back to it. So it was teammate plus geras minus the chance of losing your life equals kleos. Whereas for Achilles, it's teammate and plus geras minus the guarantee of losing your life equals kleos. That's what he's chosen. So at various points in the story, this seems sort of more and less important to him, depending on what's going on. So we get, obviously in book 9, he says that nothing as I see it now equals the value of life. Later on, he sort of readily accepts his death once Patroclus is dead. But before he goes into battle, and his mum says, you're going to die soon too, he says, I will welcome death when it comes, but for now he just wants to win glory. And we see at the end of book 19 as well, when his horses speak to him and prophesy his death, he says, why are you telling me this? I don't care. I don't care. He's on a short timeline now, and so he has to make it worth it. He has to have these particularly glorious deeds, and that's why we see, obviously they're not in your prescribed books, but book 20 and book 21, he goes on these absolute rampages, blocks the river, fights the river. He becomes this sort of superhuman person because he's feeling the urgency of his shorter time. And then finally, obviously, you can only really know that you've won kleos once you're dead. And the way in which the men treat the dead is an example of that. So if you are killed and forgotten about and left to rot, you haven't achieved kleos because people haven't clearly remembered you. But if you are honoured after your death, then you've achieved that kleos. People still respect you. And it's an example of both the kleos and the time. So we see that in Patroclus. Homer dedicates an entire book, all of book 17 is the fight over his body. Which sort of reflects and mirrors the fight over Sarpedon's body as well in book 16 when he makes it dark to make it all the more murderous, the fight over Sarpedon's body as a sort of symbol of his greatness. So book 17, lots of men die protecting Patroclus's body. And then we also see it in book 23, the extent to which they go to and honouring him in book 23. He gets sort of all the horses, all the dogs, his chariot. It gets lots of people all have to mourn him. And then we see this picked up and reflected in the next book, in book 24, with the arrival of Hector's body back to Troy. And the fact that Homer decides to end the poem on thus with the funeral rites of horse taming Hector. really leaves us with this sort of question of whether this immortal glory that Hector has traded his life for is worth it. Hector has completed the final stage of that heroic equation there, and we are left as an audience to decide, was it worth it? Would we do the same? So that's a brief whistle-stop tour of Time and Kleos. Obviously, this isn't how you would set out an essay, but I hope that I've sort of jogged your memory of some Year 12 content. I'm going to leave you just with two scholars that if you got a heroism essay or a character essay, I hope that you'd use these scholars. I think that a character essay is more likely to come to a 20 marker, in which case you don't need this scholarship, of course, but perhaps it might inform some of your arguments and your thinking. So we get Peter Jones. He says that the heroes are not fighting machines. They long to go home. And so this is where we've got to think of them in a humanistic framework. They are not just warriors. They are not just caring about fighting. What else do they care about? Expand your essay beyond just fighting. And then we get this quote from Michael Silk that Homer's characters show no capacity for development. And I would quote that last clause there: character is conceived as static, so unmoving, unchanging. That is just so false in my mind. And so I would use this and argue strongly against it in terms of character development, both with Achilles and Hector, and the other characters as well. I think that we see plenty of character growth from them, but you would have to evidence that to make it a convincing argument. Okay, bye.